Okay, good morning and welcome to this seminar entitled Caught in the Crossfire, Climate Policy and Geostrategic Rivalry in the US-China-EU Relations. So my name is Emma Hakala and I'm a leading scholar here at FIA and I will be chairing this seminar. This morning we will be talking about climate change and the efforts to mitigate it in a changing and increasingly tense geopolitical situation. In fact, I would say that tense is quite a mild word to describe the situation we are in, where we have, first of all, the US under the new President Donald Trump sort of reversing its commitments and advances on the mitigation of climate change, while also seeming to deliberately be sort of objecting to any effort to continue on the climate mitigation track. Then we also have China, which is now it is the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, but has also risen to a commanding position on clean technology supply chains. And then there's Europe, which aims to hold on to its Green European Deal, but it's also weakened by not only the growing economic pressures and electoral backlash, but also reliance on the US for its security and still needed fossil fuel supplies. So the situation is complicated, but luckily we have Michael Meling here to guide us through it, at least, and maybe give some thoughts about what to expect in the future. So Michael I'm happy to say that he's a non-resident fellow at FIA, but he's also a deputy director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research at MIT, and a professor at the University of Strathclyde Law School in Glasgow. And in his work, he focuses on climate policy design and implementation at the domestic and international levels. Michael also has a paper forthcoming entitled In the Vortex of Great Power Competition, Climate Trade and Geostrategic Rivalry in US-China-EU Relations, and he will be presenting this paper today. So after Michael's talk, we'll then hear comments by my excellent colleague Antto Vihma, who is a research professor here at FIA and leads our Center for Climate Politics and Security. And then we'll have a broader discussion. But now, without further ado, I'll give the floor to Michael. Go ahead.
Kiitos, Emma. And it's nice to be back. Kiitos, Antto, as well. It's fantastic to be back. I think it's the fourth time that I'm at FIA, second time in the new premises. So, and full disclosure, Emma said, I'm presenting a paper. Actually, what I'm here for is fact-finding. I'm using you as kind of sounding boards for some ideas in this paper, which is still in progress. And part of the reason for that is that, as Emma said, I'm a lawyer by training, and I've worked primarily on domestic climate policy, but also as a lawyer, sort of the intersection of climate and trade, so a lot of the things that have been happening in the last several years. And I've worked in Europe, I've worked in the United States, I've worked in many developing countries, including China. So I don't come at it as an international relations scholar or political science scholar, but I've been involuntarily, you could almost say, exposed to some of these dynamics. And truly in the last several years, I've seen such dramatic changes working with governments here in Europe, European Commission, Parliament, etc., working in the US with decision makers. And most recently coming back from my first trip since the pandemic. I'd been to China many times over the last decade, which also just kind of opened my eyes to some of the trends that I think will define the next several years in this space. And so that's sort of, let's say, a disclaimer at the outset. And I really hope to get some more feedback from your perspectives. Many of you are much more versed in international relations, foreign policy. FIA, of course, that's its lifeblood, you could say. So I hope to take away some good feedback and critical feedback on the ideas that I propose in this, some of which are maybe a little bit adventurous. The presentation, I'll try to keep it to half an hour or less, is going to be structured as follows. So 3 pieces, essentially kind of tracing some of the trends. Climate policy is the starting point, but I also want to look at other trends, economic trends, market trends, etc., in these 3 regions, in these 3 powers. Then I'll spend a few words on something that I think is sufficiently familiar, namely this sort of shift from, traditionally looking at climate as an environmental issue, increasingly merging it with economic and social priorities in recent years as it became sort of industrial policyfied, and now most recently really getting a geopolitical dimension to it as well. And finally, this is sort of the exploratory part where I'm really hoping for feedback. What could this spell for the future of climate cooperation, for international climate negotiations, climate diplomacy? And I construct a few scenarios, and I'll see sort of whether you think they're credible and which of them might be the most likely to transpire. So let's start first with these trajectories, and I'll begin with, I just want to share a lot of sort of data first. I don't want to eulogize on interpretations and predictions, etc. Just some data. So US greenhouse gases, it's not been a dramatic success over recent years. The projections also, even during the Biden years, were not that it would achieve or overachieve its NDC, but there has been this gradual decline driven mostly by fossil fuel replacement or fuel switching in the power sector, switching to natural gas due to, of course, the phenomenal success of hydraulic fracturing and the boom in natural gas production at very low cost. In absolute terms, though, not in relative terms, but in absolute terms, it's one of the biggest declines in emissions globally, simply because the United States started out with such a huge, as the largest emitter. Under the legislation adopted by Congress during the previous administration, yesterday at Keskuskauppakamarin, we had a nice discussion, and I presented sort of the last 4 years and what to expect in the next several years on climate policy. And we discussed at length, of course, the signature achievements in the United States, which were legislative in particular, despite a lot of executive action, most of which has been stalled and now is being reversed. But the legislative achievements, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Chips and Science Act, and most importantly, the Inflation Reduction Act, or as I heard yesterday, IRA in Finland, have really spurred a renaissance in manufacturing investment across the board. Of course, mostly in clean technology, but this really is sort of a step change in what had been previously a relatively plateauing baseline of investments in manufacturing. You can really see sort of how from the date of adoption of this, the Inflation Reduction Act in particular in 2022, and in summary, this on a you could almost say, what's the expression, sort of on the pin of a needle, if you remember how in August 2022, passage of this bill was all but uncertain. Afterwards, of course, everybody said, of course, this is US leadership on climate. But it was so unclear that this would actually pass with Joe Manchin's, decisive vote to get it over the hurdle. But since then, you can see this surge in investment. This is a quarterly sort of report that my center does with a partner in the United States to track, announced investments in clean energy deployment, but also in manufacture. You can see sort of really this dramatic increase, which became the envy of Europe and put such tremendous pressure on Europe to follow suit, even to rename how it calls its legislation. Now we have a Critical Materials, Raw Materials Act. We have a Net Zero Industry Act, following the nomenclature of US legislation. But not to forget, even during the Biden years, all the way back to Obama, Trump 1, and Biden, we've seen this continued growth in extraction, production of fossil fuels, which remarkably has made the US, for several years in a row now, the largest producer of petroleum products and gas in the world. And in fact, this Energy Information Administration chart came with a nice title: US largest producer of petroleum in history ever. So this, of course, cannot leave climate policy trajectories and national policy preferences unaffected, this fundamental trend. So all in all, the way I would sort of summarize this is that we've had these tremendous swings in the United States from one administration to another because the politics around climate and decarbonization are so enormously partisan and have resulted in gridlock, and at the executive level at least, also rollbacks with each successive administration. I call it 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Many would probably say 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. Remains to be seen. Yesterday, at least, I sort of tried to show that there are market forces and legal barriers and other dynamics, subnational, national, etc., that hopefully will halt some of the apparent momentum right now to reverse all the progress during the previous 4 years. Nonetheless, we have seen this investment. A lot of that investment is already dispersed and is in the market and is manifesting itself in construction, in building new manufacturing capacities, a lot of that in Republican states, in fact, around 80%. Yet this dominant position, fossil fuel extraction, now the narrative, energy dominance, unleashing American energy dominance, the title of one of the executive orders of January 20th. And this focus now, where in Europe we always say, affordable, secure, and sustainable. In the US, it's now all at the federal political level, at least all about affordable, reliable, and secure. Affordable, reliable, and secure. Focus on baseload, a focus on fossil fuel energy sources, and a few others like nuclear, geothermal, etc., hydropower. Certainly not wind, certainly not solar. At the international level, this manifests itself in time and again withdrawing from international climate cooperation and then returning again. So Anto and I wrote a paper back in 2017 as the Trump administration 1.0 finally announced its withdrawal from Paris. Took, I can't remember, 8 months or so since after the inauguration. This time, they were much faster, happened on day 1. And although it takes a year to take effect under the terms of the Paris Agreement, the US is already kind of like disengaged, you can say, de facto. What's also been visible across administrations, starting with Obama and then Trump 1, and continuing under Joe Biden, is this focus on intervention, abandoning decades of the Washington consensus, pushing back against centrally planned economies during the Cold War and sort of espousing free market, liberalism around the world. The US is no longer that place. It's championing an entirely different economic policy and its manifestation in foreign policy and trade relations. And so during the Biden years already, we saw a huge increase in industrial policy deployment with trade restrictions or distortions. And that's, of course, now even further accelerating. During Biden, at least, it had sort of a green veil, you could say. That now is, of course, also gone. It's purely about coercing trade partners to adopt stances, positions, responses that favor, the Trump policy agenda. And this, of course, undermines alliances and undermines cooperation and just sort of the mood of international relations. Now, Europe, I don't have to say, I think, much. Of course, this steady success since 1990 in reducing emissions, and much of it not driven by some market forces like in the US, hydraulic fracturing, gas, etc., but you can really, I think, argue, and there's enough research that shows that empirically, sector by sector or policy by policy, that policies have played a role here, and there's been continuity. And continuity across cycles, institutional cycles, elections at the member state level and at the EU level. Of course, there have been some outliers from time to time, and some periods where the priorities have been recalibrated, but by and large, it is remarkable how continuous and consistent EU climate leadership has been, as well as public support across parties until now. And I think there is clearly pressure building, given a number of different factors, international factors and domestic factors, that are threatening to sort of, I think, at least weaken that long-term consistent thrust towards leadership. One thing also just to mention, out of so many, I was also trying to find some slides that show kind of industrial and manufacturing output, new manufacturing announcements, etc., to juxtapose it with the United States. I couldn't find good data. Sure, Teppo would have better data than I have, but what I did sort of want to mention, at least one thing is, we're maybe remarkably, Europe has been able to cut its dependencies on imports of coal, petroleum products, and gas from Russia quite dramatically, reducing it to bare minimum in those where it still imports like liquefied natural gas, which is kind of circumvention of restrictions in part. But as you can see, it's now becoming more dependent on the United States, which is its largest supplier of petroleum and the largest supplier of LNG. Of course, not pipeline gas across the Atlantic, but at least of two of these fossil fuel sources. So this, of course, also affects its ability to respond and be sort of, well, let's say it's the range or the freedom of its responses vis-a-vis the US. My interpretation, or sort of my summary here, would be, it's been very consistent. The last 5 years in particular have been a remarkable increase in ambition, even during several external shocks, COVID, Russia invading Ukraine. Each time it's sort of, okay, we move even faster. Rather than slowing down, we move even faster. But at the same time, it's starting to show some cracks or tensions there. There are frictions. Inflation Reduction Act, and the growing concern about competitiveness, the green leakage that was being observed, more and more announcements of European companies investing in the US, for instance, in addition to already decades, and especially in recent years, growing competition from countries like China, non-market economies with excess production capacities, and more recently, sort of this broader sentiment. I mean, there's so complex politics everywhere in each of these regions, but in Europe, of course, that competitiveness has been now hampered by the green ambition of the last 5 years. We need to simplify, potentially pause. And you've heard these calls. Of course, the omnibus bill that's expected at the end of this month is supposed to sort of show that there's a willingness as part of this clean industrial deal to strengthen the production location Europe, make it more attractive again. Will it be enough? I mean, there have been calls to actually pause certain things. CSRD is paused. Some have called for the CBAM to be paused in addition to being simplified. So clearly, I think as majorities, as party preferences, as the domestic politics at member state level change and the composition of the European Parliament, there are tensions and question marks arising. And so how will this translate in these decades of climate leadership, uncompromising climate leadership pretty much? And how will the recalibration of priorities affect that? And I think this sort of being stuck as a continent near conflict zones, more exposed to immigration from, for instance, climate or crisis-disrupted regions, still very reliant on the United States for security guarantees and, as I just showed, also for energy increasingly, and yet at the same time traditionally trying to maintain more open ties, more engagement at the multilateral level, commitment to the rules-based international order. How is this all going to play out? How will it affect Europe's role or relationship with China, for instance, where we've already seen changes? And now finally China, and here I have more graphs because I find them just absolutely remarkable, and they kind of speak for themselves and for the reactions that they prompt in other parts of the world. So of course, greenhouse gas emissions, it is the largest emitter in the world, and that is in itself something that one has to recognize. And while there's been sort of some slowdown, let's say, in the year-on-year growth, it continues to grow. What I find more remarkable is the reasons for that. We know that a lot of that emissions growth is owed to manufacturing for international markets, given the tremendous sort of reliance on export-led growth of the Chinese economy, which increasingly is threatening to imbalance or create, well, such a host of problems domestically and internationally. But what I find so remarkable is you look at one market segment after another, and in particular strategically relevant sectors. And in each of these, you see this unabated growth of production output from China and market share as well. Think of, for instance, steel, obviously a very defense and security relevant sector, where it has grown from being a relatively small producer to now being a larger producer than all other countries taken together, and exerting tremendous pressure on producers in other parts of the world, not just Europe, not just the United States, but also countries in the developing world, which are crying foul and calling for tariffs and some way of protecting domestic industries so that they do not lose their domestic steelmaking capacities. Car manufacturing. As a German, this was really surprising for me. Well, of course, we've been hearing for many years that, in electric vehicles, China is just really like moving fast. In Baku at COP29 some months ago, everywhere I drove, it was electric vehicles from China. It was fascinating. I'd never heard of some of these manufacturers. They were very nice cars, very efficient, very attractive sort of, and seemed to be, well, they seem to work well. So no wonder that Western manufacturers have been in a state of increasing, let's not say panic, but unsettledness over this leadership on electric vehicles. But it's not only electric vehicles, it's also internal combustion engine vehicles. Bloomberg data that Bank of America here sort of compiles suggests that it's already not only the largest producer, of course, again, but it's already reached 40% roughly of global output. I'm not sure I believe that data. Other data suggests it's more between 20 and 30%. But the trend, again, is what matters here. Can this continue? How long can this continue? How do other countries react? And here, a wonderful graph by the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation in the US that just looks at a whole bunch of strategically relevant sectors. And in each one, you see how China scales up its production output and starts leading, starts becoming a major player in the global market, taking over market share. It's quite obvious to me that this cannot go without significant consequences affecting domestic politics and international responses from trade partners around the world. Kind of, they've done it for decades. In a way, we should have been used to it. And that was my mindset when I was in Shanghai last year. Yes, it's the same thing that they've been doing forever. Reverse engineering, just producing cheaper and then selling. And, what's the news? The news is that it's become qualitatively and quantitatively different. And I'll get to the qualitative part in a second. It's reached sort of, I think, critical levels that are no longer tolerable by trade partners around the world for a number of economic and strategic reasons. Particularly, of course, pertinent, this is in the clean technology sector, and I'm sure you've all at one point or another seen the International Energy Agency reports that sort of look at the supply chain dominance of China in clean technologies and critical materials, and the need to sort of diversify supply chains, which has resulted in all this narrative of decoupling, de-risking supply chains, friendshoring, onshoring, strategic autonomy, etc., on both sides of the Atlantic. And you can see in a lot of these technologies, the share of global supply chains is 70, 80, 90%. In none of them is it below 30, 40%. And again, even for the energy transition, obviously this also raises questions about the risk of being so dependent on these Chinese supply chains. When I said not just quantitatively, as we reach 40, 50, 60, 70% and continued growth of market share, but also qualitative, I mean that this is no longer just simple reverse engineering and building sort of, B-class products, but much cheaper so that they dominate or start kind of being dumped on markets and take over market share. No. In so many categories, Chinese products are now very competitive also in a quality level. Not just costs, but also in terms of the features, the performance, etc. And increasingly, they are starting to take a lead on innovation. So here, Rocky Mountain Institute was looking at patent counts in clean technology and clean energy and comparing across regions, showing that, we've seen traditionally kind of all of them being roughly equal, but in recent years, China's just taking off, which probably should not surprise. When you are manufacturing 60, 70, or 80% of global output of technologies, you learn while you do this. And they have a good education system. They emphasize the STEM, science, technology, engineering, etc. And they're encouraging and increasingly investing in innovation. And so you see this rapid growth in energy patents, and here sort of also as share of global, how it's again replicating what we saw just in the quantity of output and sort of this market share penetration, now also on the innovation front, which to me means this is not a static picture, this is a predictor of a continuation of a trend. Again, as a German, I remember 15 to 20 years ago when Germany was starting to heavily invest or provide incentives for investment in renewable energy, say solar photovoltaic, creating this tremendous induced demand pull, which then spurred China into action, adopting various industrial policies, Made in China 2025, the 13th five-year plan, the 14th five-year plan, to sort of really accelerate manufacturing of these technologies, given the observed and through policy guaranteed demand in countries like Germany. It was German companies, equipment manufacturers, that went to China and essentially built these turnkey-ready facilities and told them, you know, these are the buttons you press in order to have it run. And apparently another Chinese really didn't yet have much knowledge and capacity. In the meantime, it's the other way around. German manufacturers will freely admit that China now has a technology lead and can produce more efficient wafers, more efficient models than any Western producer can. And I suspect it's the same in other technologies like electric vehicles. We increasingly see, if not rivalry, maybe even a competitive advantage on the innovation side. All right, so trying to condense that again sort of in a few bullets, you know, it's a real paradox. On the one hand, biggest emitter, still building more coal, changing some of its approaches in international investment in fossil fuels, where it's pledged to cut back, but even internationally also promoting more coal use. And yet at the same time, absolute dominance of manufacturing clean technology, clean raw materials or minerals, critical minerals, and also the deployment, the annual investments in new solar and new wind in China outdo all the investments elsewhere over many, many years. It may have become a little bit different now with these packages like Inflation Reduction Act and some of the European Green Deal thing. That probably has recalibrated it a little bit, but in absolute terms, again, China still remains absolutely dominant here. It has pledges. It has sort of domestically started really showing that it intends to curb emissions growth, plateau by 2030, and then eventually reach carbon neutrality. And there's clearly also domestic pressure to do so, from air pollution to climate vulnerability along the Chinese coast and in the southwest of the country, water resources, etc. There's many reasons why China has an interest in doing this. Yet internationally, whether it's COP29 or previous negotiations, you can still observe that China is very much stuck in this mindset of 2 to 3 decades ago. We're a, you know, now of course they're a middle income country, a very modern country in parts of China at least, but they still sort of live in that formal role of a developing of a non-Annex 1 country that should not have any binding commitments, should not have any obligation to engage in technology transfer, climate finance, etc. And of course, as I was hinting before, the trends that I was showing have invariably, inevitably resulted in responses in a rethinking of trade relations in the West. Janet Yellen, her famous speech in 2022, it was at Brookings sort of saying our relation to China has to change. What was it? Small yard, high fence, you know, increasingly for some areas, we're now going to have to strategically exclude China with export restrictions, etc. And, you know, this is also, of course, the case in Europe. EVs, a bit less blunt than the US, just 100%. Europe, a bit more nuanced with trade remedies, so countervailing duties for individual Chinese manufacturers, etc. But we see sort of these reactions starting to increase. The whole idea of a global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum between the US and Europe, similarly very much directed against China and its dominance in steel and aluminum manufacturing. And so how do these paradoxes play out sort of in the medium and long term in China's positioning based on its self-interest, based on its factual, you know, de facto dominance in, for instance, green technology supply chains? How does that play out in international negotiations and climate diplomacy? All right, I'll briefly sort of, this is, I think, kind of familiar terrain. This is more the narrative of the last 3 to 4 years, the rise in industrial policy. I think what's worth kind of reminding ourselves of is that this really was and marks a paradigm shift. Climate policy no longer being kind of an isolated thing, you know, an environmental thing, and we commit to it and we do it because of the environmental objectives. Over the last several years, there's really been a tacit, I would say, understanding on both sides of the Atlantic that to really advance decarbonization goals, you need to merge the environmental dimension with the social and economic dimensions. And the Green Deals on both sides of the Atlantic are kind of the expression of that, if you like. But then the policies implementing that, Inflation Reduction Act in the US, Net Zero Industry Act in Europe, and CBAM and other policies, kind of reflect or manifest and operationalize this new understanding of using industrial policy with heavy intervention in trade. And so we see this curve that Simon Evenet and his folks put together, this dramatic increase in industrial policies, even just in the last 2 years, of which a majority are trade distortive. Local content requirements, import and export restrictions, tariffs, trade remedies, etc., all of which interfere with the previously freer trade in goods, services, capital, and knowledge. UNCTAD, or UN Trade, has made nice assessments of trying to sort of show how increasingly we also find trade-related climate measures, TRCMs, in NDCs, and as a tool of climate policy, sort of really targeting and intervening in trade. And here's the picture of Janet Yellen, as I mentioned earlier, Johns Hopkins, Anto. So I wonder if Johannes Urpilainen was there. But anyway, so this expanded use of trade distortions, very targeted, very intentional, and increased also a number of trade conflicts before the WTO, despite its diminishing sort of relevance, but especially unilateral ones. So under domestic law, countervailing duty investigations, anti-dumping investigations, etc. All of this, of course, translates into a trend towards more market fragmentation from previously more open markets. They never were perfectly open, but decades of trade liberalization and integration of economies has now reversed, and it really started in the United States. Jake Sullivan and Jennifer Harris, two key players, of course, National Security Advisor and a senior assistant or advisor in the National Security Council, had written an article just before Biden was elected in 2020, how foreign policy and foreign strategic objectives should influence trade policy, and also how foreign policy should serve the middle class. This was kind of some of the intellectual underpinnings that then saw their manifestation in a lot of the legislative and policy development under the Biden administration, spilling over to Europe, accelerating some of the same trends in Europe and pressuring Europe to respond. We've also seen conflicts such as China suing Inflation Reduction Act, sort of conditional subsidies, for instance, before the WTO. Suing is the wrong word. Starting, dispute settlement procedure, whatever the worth of that may be, given the absence of an appellate body or the non-existence of a functioning appellate body, and the fact that this will end in limbo. So, all in all, just to kind of remind ourselves, this has already sparked, even before Trump, a tit-for-tat retaliation escalation that just keeps continuing. From sector to sector, we see, step and counter-step, reaction, counter-reaction, etc. And it certainly has changed the nature of international economic relations in that paradigm shift I mentioned. What's interesting to me here, or I think worth mentioning, is that already research is starting to try and calculate what the impacts on the energy transition globally will be in terms of increasing the cost, of course, of access to clean technology supplies. Simply by adding tariffs to Chinese EVs, you make them more expensive, so you will slow down and you will increase the cost of decarbonizing, at least through that supply chain. There are others, but they probably are more expensive. So that's the sort of immediate static effect. The long-term effect, though, is that it will also interfere with the learning rates. Those are innovation and technology spillovers across borders when you interfere with these, the openness of markets. And so researchers at the ETH Zurich, for instance, tried to quantify how much already the interventions in the market under the Inflation Reduction Act will slow down the cost decline of clean technologies due to disruption of this innovation spillover effect across borders. Just briefly mentioning, in the past, looking historically, solar PV according to the IPCC, is the most important mitigation option we have over the next decade towards meeting decarbonization targets, bar none. I mean, changes in land use change, etc., carbon removals, none of them rival the impact of solar PV alone. And a big reason of that is, of course, the tremendous drop in cost of solar PV. And that tremendous drop in cost, over 90% over the last 20 years, probably closer to 95%, is owed to spillover processes across borders. Teppo Sakinen knows that I've been working on this for quite a while and had a paper at Baku on spillovers, where I try to sort of trace this and show that fragmentation of international trade threatens to slow down spillovers that have been absolutely crucial to having global access through steps in individual countries like Germany, other European countries, surely also Finland, investing, bringing the cost to fall, spurring producers elsewhere to scale up production in China where they have a comparative advantage or have created a comparative advantage, and then making the decarbonization options available globally at reduced cost. And you can see how this was a sort of cross-border process from the earliest stages of discovering the photoelectric effect to scaling it up, discovering niche applications, starting to build sort of production capacities in countries, and then gradually, it ends up in China, of course, where they, over millennia, have just mastered this art of optimizing, scaling up, and becoming efficient and cheap in production. And as a German, particularly sort of both painful and kind of heartening is we lost all solar production capacity that we had for a while managed to spur in Germany, Brandenburg in particular. There's really sort of a Silicon Valley for solar manufacturing. It all went to China. So industrial policy-wise, it was a tremendous failure 2 decades ago, 15 years ago. But in terms of spurring cost declines that then stimulate uptake and decarbonization around the world, I was very glad to see that finally somebody tried to quantify that. I'd always been arguing, Germany has helped subsidize low-cost solar for sub-Saharan Africa, for Southern Asia, etc., around the world, and thus stimulated the uptake and made it a competitive, really sort of viable electricity generation option, which it wasn't 20 years ago. And now you can see that this research by Todd Girardin in Management Science, published 1.5 years ago, already suggests that by 2016, roughly, more than 85% of all solar stimulated by German policies earlier in the 2000s could be seen elsewhere outside of Germany. So the effects of those subsidies, the feed-in tariffs in the early 2000s, were now responsible for way more deployment of solar PV outside Germany than in Germany itself at that point. And this, of course, will only continue to increase as more and more is deployed in the rest of the world. Okay, this raises tremendous questions. I won't go into this, but strategic interests, economic interests versus comparative advantage. And we are interfering. This is kind of the short version of this whole narrative about spillovers, etc. We're interfering with natural comparative advantage, you could say, of countries, owed in many cases to industrial policy interventions. In China, formidable example of how a government can kind of build industries and keep them capable of producing below cost and exporting, but nonetheless, in the process, developing comparative advantages other countries can't rival. And we're starting to say, no, we're going to prevent that. We don't want that. And so it does raise questions. Ricardo, comparative advantage, that's what free trade leverages in order to reduce costs for everybody. But then there are these other strategic concerns and these security concerns that kind of counteract and weigh against it. And of course, social and economic concerns. And how does this all play out again? What's the ultimate kind of takeaway of that? So now I'll just, in the last 3 slides, essentially, I'll just kind of propose a few scenarios that I could see coming out of this, but it's still forming in my own mind, and that's why I'm really grateful for any thoughts on your part or any input. It's sort of based on, and Ante's been helpful in kind of informing my thinking on this, on a Putnam 2-level game approach where you essentially argue that international positions in international diplomacy and international relations are a function of domestic politics. And have to sort of reflect and respond to the preferences and priorities of domestic constituencies to maintain, political stability, majorities, etc., across elections domestically. And so this two-level game perspective would take all those trends and all the fundamental data that I showed earlier and try to translate that into how could this express itself in future international climate cooperation. The first scenario I would say is kind of the most optimistic one, in which you really see a lot of the trends that we've observed recently, roll back politically in the US now, perhaps some slowdown in the political support for decarbonization, for the Green Deal in Europe, etc., be only a temporary thing, and there be sufficient kind of stabilizing factors. In the US, several states continue, market forces continue the investment trends. Solar PV remains the cheapest despite attempts by the Trump administration to slow down deployment of renewables and favor fossil fuels. The market just doesn't participate. The EU is able to overcome some of the kind of headwinds that it is currently facing. And so what we instead see is continued competition, but in a sort of more virtuous sense, that now multiple parts of the world are investing heavily in renewables. There's still this overarching belief that we need to decarbonize. This is a common cause, and that drives down, of course, continues to drive down the cost of technology, which then spurs adoption around the world. We may not see the healthy multilateralism that we had, for instance, preceding adoption of the Paris Agreement, or healthy is perhaps a bit exaggerated, but sort of still quite functional. I mean, it's always been a up and down game, but there is still at least cooperation on many areas where there are shared interests. Trade measures and this whole turn to industrial policy continues to be a factor, but there's also increased recognition that negative implications of fragmentation, of cutting off supply chains, of strategic autonomy, etc., warrant kind of still keeping some trade openness. And also tools like the CBAM enable European producers to survive without having to have complete, shut national economies. And altogether, this would sort of translate into continued decarbonization. Probably not fast enough to meet our Paris Agreement targets, but at least there is sort of continued direction of travel in the right direction. Now, the second one would be the more pessimistic one. And this one, I mean, really, I have to say, in the first one, I would also add, I could even see a scenario where China, which has been torn between, wanting to be a responsible global citizen, having increasingly stringent domestic climate commitments, but yet torn or caught, coal emissions, etc., nonetheless, with its economic interest in global decarbonization as a source of demand for the products that it leads the market in, could become a champion for climate cooperation, which it hasn't been in the past. So in the most optimistic scenario, maybe China would rise to fill the gap that the withdrawal of the United States leaves behind, and really change how it perceives itself and sees itself in the international climate regime. The opposite would be in scenario 2. So this is really sort of each nation to itself, a Hobbesian, if you like, kind of worldview, in which everything that's been sort of fraying international relations in recent years just accelerates, and we end up in a world in which you have sort of different blocks. China is more or less isolated from Europe, from North America in terms of trade and trade relations. Hard to imagine, given that the rhetoric tends to still be much more harsh than the actual reality of international trade flows. But, tariffs of 10, 20, 30% can start really changing that. And of course, even stricter things like export restrictions and tit-for-tat retaliation could start really accelerating that. That, of course, spills over into international climate relations. This means China would really sort of maybe retrench into its we're a developing country, don't come to us for climate leadership. You, Europe, United States, you should be doing more. The US is the big bad guy kind of. Climate finance comes to a standstill. North-South tensions start escalating more than they have already in the past. And of course, the cost of decarbonization technologies and access to decarbonization technologies, cost increases and access decreases as a result of all this. slowing the diffusion of clean technologies. And the EU is in this weird position between a fossil giant, the United States, which is entirely out of climate cooperation, China, which is sort of, in its own retrenchment, and Europe is unable, maybe, being dependent for security for fossil fuel imports from the US, etc., unable to kind of try and still pull those countries in the world that might want to move along on its own. And finally, sort of maybe an interim or an intermediate scenario, which is sort of maybe the most realistic in my view, in which there is still some appetite for cooperation, very specific things. Even industry might still continue collaborating. Markets will continue favoring the cheapest options. You know, technology costs will continue to decline because somewhere there remains innovation still occurs. And luckily, even politics can normally not change, you know, the cost of technology or reverse cost declines. But it is still a very difficult world for multilateralism, and what you have is sort of very specific piecemeal cooperation on benign or uncontroversial issues. What I could see also is that you really start seeing more north-south focused, very strategically, very self-interest driven partnerships between the US and certain countries, say in the Americas, Europe with just energy transition partnerships and clean trade and investment partnerships, the Global Gateway, you know, China with the Belt and Road Initiative. So there's also maybe more dynamism in the north-south, but very much along sort of these strategic or geopolitical venues. So that would be my sort of attempt to kind of distill factors that I observe at the national level in my work and in my research and see what that could mean for international relations. And now I want to hear what the experts might have to say on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. I'm Antto Vihma from FIA. You have the pleasure to give a couple of comments. It was really enjoyable presentation. It's such a lovely thing to be able to host you again. And I was just, I don't know how the audience feels, but I just found myself like wondering, being completely in awe with how the world has changed. I have this feeling in many seminars these days, but this time again it just struck me. I started remembering the good old days. I started remembering 10 years ago in climate policy when the President of the United States, Barack Obama, and quite new President of China, Xi Jinping, announced their targets together in China. In a very relaxed atmosphere. There are these nice pictures of them. They don't have a tie. They have unbuttoned their collars. They're having fun. And they are showing leadership to the world. We are actually now making good progress. We're going further together than we could separately. And this was 10 years ago, before Paris Agreement. I think 2014. We've come so far from that it's sometimes you just have to sit down and think that, wow. And even further, Napoleon Bonaparte is often quoted saying that if you want to understand somebody, you have to know what the world was like when they were 20. I'm not sure if he actually said this, but it's been put in his mouth. And I was 20 in the late 90s, and that's already quite a while ago. But still, if you think of that mood, that disposition in the world, it's so different. There were youth movements. People of my age were protesting in the streets, large-scale protests in the streets, because international organizations have too much power. There was huge demonstrations against the WTO because of the perception that WTO controls the world, and the national governments are just like, puppets that can't do their politics anymore, because the power is there in the international organizations, IMF as well. Even the G7 and G20 meetings were seen as some kind of great power hubs where power really lies. It seems unbelievable now that also Michael hinted at the state of the WTO nowadays, paralyzed, totally irrelevant in a way. But even on a more deeper level, in the late 90s, there was this largely held belief that if you do some kind of anti-liberal economic policies, if you interfere in the market forces, if you do tariffs and industrial policy, you will be punished by the so-called global market forces. Any kind of trade distortion will bite you back hard. You can't do that, especially as a small country, but also as a great power. That was kind of the idea, and we don't even have to go to 10 years or 5 years back when industrial policy was still, as Michael's graph showed, it didn't exist that much in the West, and if it did, it was really something that one was ashamed of, or like it was considered generally a very bad thing to do. This has all changed. We've had numerous events on great power competition and the emerging multipolarity of the world, and so have other institutes. I'm not being too critical of us, but it's been everywhere. So I think what Michael was presenting, kind of this empirical basis where we are, and then building new scenarios is now the right way to go. That we need scenarios. We need to go a bit further than saying that there are tensions and rivalries and so forth. And we don't know, of course, what's going to happen. That's my main point also about remembering what things were like in climate politics 10 years ago and how things were seen in the economic globalization discussion in the 90s. We certainly don't know what's going to happen, but we have to make scenarios and we have to start thinking of them in more detail. Be strategic and really think about them. I would, if I was to play around with scenarios, I might think of two confrontational scenarios. Michael had one, and of course, when you're doing ideal types, you don't have to be too specific, but I would definitely see that there could be a confrontational geoeconomic world where some might argue that we already are there, where the great power competition is conducted by economic means, tariffs, counter-tariffs, some harder means as well, export restrictions, tit-for-tat energies, and that would lead to economic fragmentation and these kinds of hindrances to innovation and climate policy and cooperation altogether. We could go down to that kind of confrontational road, or you could be even a lot more pessimistic and see a geopolitical confrontation type of world, where actually all trade, all economic relations take the back seat. The obvious trigger for this would be Taiwan situation, should that become a source of actual geopolitical conflict. And in that case, things are even worse. So I'm not sure if Michael's pessimistic scenario was quite pessimistic enough in my taste. Also, in the manuscript you sent, you also had this. You used the classic two-level game, where on one level states are competing internationally, and on the other level they are signaling to domestic audiences. And I think that's a very interesting and fruitful way of looking at things, because we have a tendency to overemphasize the international level, I believe, a rather strong tendency of that. So to keep in mind that a lot of the moves that seem that seem, moves in the international chessboard are something that the people in power do to signal the domestic audiences. Trump for the MAGA crowd. I don't see any other real interest or motivation to talk about Greenland than to signal expansion, signal making America great again. Certainly don't see the business case for rare earths or so to be lying in Greenland currently. And also authoritarians do it. Authoritarians also signal their crowds. It's not just a democratic game. It's good to keep in mind. And climate policy is part of the game, as Michael noted. It's the one that has to take a back seat when these kinds of powers are at play. And also in the geoeconomic world, I would say that climate stuff is very vulnerable. One eye-opening remark I thought was Trump was not re-elected yet, and J.D. Vance was not in the office either yet. But he said that if the EU regulates social media platforms, I think it was precisely Twitter X that was mentioned, the US would then retaliate by weakening or blowing up NATO. So these kinds of policy interlinkages of regulation and security policy don't leave a lot room for climate considerations. That's another, I think, case for pessimism. And the domestic pressure that we're encountering against climate politics currently, of course, in EU it takes form of the central right governments, governments where center-right parties work together with populist parties who are mainly against climate policies, and that causes a climate backlash kind of dynamics. In the US, of course, it's Trump's hold of the Republican Party, and currently what's even more scarier than last time is, of course, that they have a plan. They are much more ready. Taking care of Paris Agreement didn't take long this time, and also the techno oligarchs are on board, which might hamper the way climate politics can be even discussed in social media platforms. And also the right-wing media ecosystem is so strong, and there's nothing on the other side that compares to it, which makes you wonder if the system has tilted to a new balance, whether it's 50-50 anymore with the liberal and conservative vote in the US. I'm very poorly equipped to talk about China, but just what one wonders is what is Xi's legacy? What does he actually want to achieve in his days of power? I think that's one of the crucial questions. We're back in sort of Kremnology. You have to think, go inside the head of a great leader in order to know what's going to happen. But definitely it's an interesting case of where there's some kind of expansion or a more open conflict with the West is required, or whether it can be mitigated in the Chinese thinking. So 3 points. We don't know what happens, underlined by the fact that so much has changed so quickly. We need scenario work. I think they are the ones that would enable us to think of the future in some clear-headed way. And thirdly, finally, it does not look good. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Antto. And maybe I know that Michael is keen to get feedback also from the audience, so we'll reserve time for that. But I'll first let you have a chance to respond to Antto's comments.
Kiitos. That's kind of my main comment. All of it, there's nothing I would disagree with. And I'm heartened that you think scenario building is a good way to do it. And I'll really consider expanding the pessimistic scenario and maybe splitting it up in sort of different ways, or maybe adding a whole section. Let's see. But that's all very, very useful. Thank you.
As a rejoinder then to that, I would also maybe ask about the sort of importance of climate in this emerging situation in your scenarios, maybe, because it's even surprising to me that I'm thinking about this, because I've always thought that climate change is just becoming even so sort of physically real that we can no longer ignore it in our analysis and in our politics and so on. But then if there are deliberate attempts, for example, or especially in the US now in the current presidency, to kind of rule out the use even of the word of climate change, and to actually oppose the actions to mitigate it. And I know that there is a kind of like a good grounds in Europe as well for these kinds of politics, and to even repeal the whole European Green Deal. So do you think that actually climate change will still play, or how significant role would it have, especially in your more pessimistic scenario?
So, I mean, I'm sort of, I think, incorrigibly optimistic. We talked last night about, for instance, the changing media landscape. I think Anto is more convinced than I that indeed you could see systematic and thorough silencing of discussions, debates, like we've seen with textbooks being rewritten and policy documents in some states in the US omitting the words climate change. Websites have already disappeared. I've been trying to find some charts from the previous administration and agencies. They're gone, but there are, of course, the Wayback Machine and the archive, and you can find them if you want. And so just looking specifically at the US, I think Europe is in a much still healthier situation despite some of those headwinds. But there are states that are extremely progressive, more progressive also in public opinion than the average European sort of perception, I would say. And they're not going to just be steamrolled into, climate denial. It's inconceivable. I mean, this would really then, this would be a pessimistic scenario that reaches the level of a complete revolution and dismantling of the constitutional structures, checks and balances, division of power, etc. One really has to think of a very glum scenario, one where you have California secede and then it's a separate jurisdiction. I don't think we're there yet, and I think that a lot of the noise and the momentum that we see now, a lot of the disconcerting and disappointing sort of silence of progressive companies, technology companies, private sector more generally, Wall Street, and also of Republican legislators and governors, etc., that have been much more climate open in the past and that have significant domestic interests, like clean technology boom, Texas, for instance. I think that's momentary. I think there's a moment now where everybody's hesitant to be the first to kind of criticize or push back or say, wait a minute, we have thousands, tens of thousands of jobs in the wind sector. You just want to kill that? I'm a Republican, but I don't agree on this. Nobody's sort of yet come out and started. Eventually, I think there will be a crumbling of the perceived invulnerability and this sort of claim of a historical mandate of Trump. It's not that historic. The majority in the House is less than 5 representatives. It's one of the narrowest, in decades. And in the Senate, it's shrunk after Marco Rubio has been appointed Secretary of State. So I think it's a temporary thing. But I'm not saying that there's not always a tail end probability that things can go completely wrong. And I hope that's not the case. And I believe, Emma, and I didn't put it in the slides, but I also have played with the thought, and I think the report might mention it, every major climate extreme weather event or other sort of climate attributed crisis has changed public opinion. Katrina 2005 was a major sort of event in getting US public opinion to shift somewhat. And all it would take is some real sort of significant to, I think, make people again say, wait a minute, it was nice to believe it's not happening, but now we again are reminded it is happening, it's bad, we need to do something about that. That's a depressing way of thinking about a possible resurgence of concern about climate and public support for climate action and push back against this kind of like, we'll just act like it doesn't exist. It's not even such active denial, it's just sort of like, it's a green scam and it's not mentioned anywhere in all these executive orders. Climate is just not mentioned. I think there would be pushback that it wouldn't be sustainable politically.
Okay, thank you for giving us some hope at least. Okay, let's open the floor for questions. Any questions or comments? Oh, there's one, Mohammed. Please introduce yourself and keep the comments quite short.
Hi, Mohammed Hadi. I'm a research fellow here at FIA. First of all, thank you for your presentation. And I'm in no way an expert on climate policy, but I do geoeconomics, so I look at these same things, but from a different perspective. But here as well as in geoeconomics, there is this people do not pay attention to the microeconomic aspect of this equation, meaning that like the industrial policies now in the West are like a counter-reaction to China's artificial cheap labor, which is like systematically in China, people are like earning way less than what they produce. So there is this threat that we are like redoing that, and we will end up like in way less purchasing power for workers here in the West and also in China. Like, if you get what I mean. Thank you.
Any other questions at this point? Yes, Carolina.
Yeah, thank you for a really interesting presentation on the scenarios. I was wondering China's sort of motivation to step in, particularly from the perspective of Global South. I was wondering in these scenarios, China's role on the international level, I think it might look very different whether we look at it from the perspective of North or South. So like you mentioned that China has not been willing to accept these binding obligations towards climate finance, yet at the same time it has been constructing its own sort of climate finance with Chinese characteristics with this South-South climate cooperation, or building this leader role of Global South in the climate politics. So I was wondering whether if we look at China's sort of willingness to withdraw from this developing country status, I was thinking about with the current situation and Trump administration, how do you see what is the sort of incentive or motivation for China to step in? Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. And then apparently there was a hand in the back, which I don't see.
Hi, Teppo Säkkinen from Finland Chamber of Commerce. My question is actually quite a continuation from Carolina on the role of China. Michael, you mentioned that in one scenario there could be a strategic interest for China in advancing global decarbonization. And what we saw in the previous Trump administration was that Xi Jinping came with the 2060 climate neutrality goal during that era. Now, on the other hand, in Baku, I don't think that we saw any kind of change in China's overall position in the negotiations. That was really defensive and clinging on to the developing country status. Perhaps some in the finance side, kind of opening the streams of financing to the south, but overall very defensive. So kind of interested to hear if you have noticed any signals or reasons for hope of China in kind of changing the mindset, and also seeing that in global climate policy, advancing global decarbonization is in their strategic interest. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we have microeconomic aspects and then China's role. Maybe I'll actually give the floor first to Antto if you want to react to something, and then we'll wrap up with Michael.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of food for thought. I was also like what Emma noted and Michael commented upon. I do believe, being a pessimist or not, but I do believe that the physically real climate impacts do have political consequences. I think we've seen it all over again in the Scandinavian context, in Sweden, in Denmark, and certainly in the US as well. So it's something that that will have impacts on also the political debate, no matter what. The negative, pessimistic side would then think about the media landscape, digitalization, and what some call post-truth condition, which might hamper this kind of more progressive debate in the current state of things. The microeconomics noted by Mohammed, it's true. It's hard to that would be really the race to the bottom kind of dynamics then that one would be looking at there, and I think that should be maybe could be part of the geoeconomic pessimistic scenario or like in there. On the role of China, I mean, Michael and others, I think you're able to make a very remarkable business case for China. I mean, I saw the graphs as well. I mean, the position is dominant. They stand to gain a lot of the green transition currently. Definitely there's a strategic case and there's an economic interest in there. One just sometimes wonder that in the IR field, do we overemphasize? Do we have a tendency to overemphasize economic rationality sometimes?
That's a great point. You know, I can't remember, was it us speaking last night, or no, it was also saying, you know, these climate impacts, if they accelerate migration to Europe due to climate disruption in neighboring regions, say in Northern Africa and the Near East, etc., could have this very destabilizing negative, you know, vicious cycle of then giving even more support to nationalist or populist parties that are anti-immigration and also climate skeptical. I mean, so there's so much uncertainty, I think, in indeed. It may not just be, oh, more climate disruption, we need to do more about climate. It may actually distract from. So that's worth pointing out. On Mohammed's question, thank you. I mean, or observation, you know, I haven't thought about that enough. I did notice in Shanghai and Environs when I was there in December, there is anxiety, there's real anguish among people. You know, there's high unemployment, youth unemployment in particular. It's very clear that there's awareness also across the population that the economic model, this tremendous dependence on government sort of stimulated exports is also a liability. And so I cannot speak to whether or not US or Europe would kind of prompt a similar race to the bottom and cutting wages, etc. I'm just looking at wage growth in the United States in recent years. Inflation is one of the inflationary pressures, of course. And however unequally distributed, it's remarkable what the salary differences are between similar jobs in North America or US specifically, and Canada, or of course Europe. So I'd have to look at that more and try and figure it out. Now to Carolina's and Teppo's question, so I really think that China has thought about, but it's caught, I think. There is sort of these principal things we are developing. We do not want to reopen that pact from 1992, you know, UNFCCC of Annex 1, non-Annex 1, etc. In principle, like in legal terms, but de facto, there's already this observation. The US, even during the Biden administration, the chair of the National Economic Council has been working at MIT for a while. So Biden's like leading economic advisor, Brian Deese, resigned 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, was burned out, and has been at MIT since then. And he's come up with this idea of a clean energy Marshall Plan. The US would self-interest driven, like, and I love the language, you know, unapologetically, the US would take leadership in building partnerships and reaching out to developing countries and meet them where their needs are, you know, kind of this wonderful use of language to sort of obfuscate a very selfish kind of America first foreign policy and development cooperation and climate cooperation policy. And I kind of pushed back and said, you know, but the world is different from the Marshall Plan era of the post-World War II world. You didn't have a China back then that was out-competing, out-innovating, etc. And he said, yeah, you're right. The joke is kind of like Europe and the US go and reach out to developing countries, and they come with a catalog of demands and conditions and so on and so forth. And China just comes with a checkbook and gives them money. And a lot of this investment under the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, is increasingly also, there's a green component of that, is increasingly going into, you know, clean technologies, clean energy deployment, etc. So I'd have to look into more detail to see what the net, like, are there still coal plants? Is there still fossil fuel investment? Or are we increasingly moving towards green? But that would kind of show that de facto, they're already doing a lot. And eventually I would assume that at some point they would be ready, because we have heard, you know, criticism of the US as an irresponsible citizen. China is the moderating, you know, the reliable partner, the consistent one. I could see that at some point spilling over to Teppo's question, also in the diplomatic context, that they say, so now is a vacuum. The US has completely discredited itself. Nobody believes, likes them anymore. They've created antagonism and tension with even their closest partners. This is the moment where we come in and become sort of a, you know, a great power also in the diplomatic parquet. And maybe, hopefully, that would also translate into more responsible attitudes towards Taiwan and other things as well. But, this is one possible outcome of many, and I certainly cannot predict it. But thanks for the questions and ideas and feedback from all this.
Thank you, Michael, for this very interesting discussion, and thank you also for the audience. We unfortunately don't have time this time to continue, but hopefully we'll be able to talk about these topics also in the future. So thank you very much.